everybody, welcome to another Spectrum Economics video. Today we're going to be looking at game theory. So some of you may be quite familiar with game theory, some of you may not, and some of you are thinking, well, does it have anything to do with games? Well, in a sense it kind of does, because you're looking at various strategies and all that. So how should we define game theory? So you can see you've got two bears here, duking it out and all that, and that's part of it as well, the whole competitive thing. You've got any number of players competing with each other in an attempt to win the game, whether it's actually a sporting event, or the game could be in business in terms of who's going to get the most sales, who's going to get the largest market share. So a big part of game theory is actually coming up with a strategy, and that strategy can't be just focused purely around yourself, but it's got to be focused around what you can do given what your competitors are going to be doing. So your competitors will have a strategy, and you need to be able to predict that strategy in order to come up with the best strategy for yourself. And games can be played amongst 2, 3, 20, even 20 players. It could be many, many players in the game. So it can get rather confusing. But for this video today, we're going to keep it fairly simple. We're going to be looking at 2, maybe a couple of 3-player games. So we're going to keep it the basics there. So 2 basic games we're going to be looking at in terms of how they're played out. One being a simultaneous game. So that is that the players basically make their moves at the same time, or they make their moves without being aware of what their opponents are doing. So it's possible you can have different timings with the games and the moves that are being made, but you don't know what moves have been made, if you get what I mean. So it is like it's being played out at the same time. So we'd call it a simultaneous game. The other type of game is what we call a sequential game. So you have a first mover, that person doesn't know what the other's going to do, but the first mover will know that they can observe your moves. Then you may have a second, third and fourth player, and they will be able to observe the moves of those that came before them. So it's about coming up with a strategy, like if you're the first player, which is going to be the best response to the best response of the players that are coming after you. And we're going to cover off on those 2 games today. And those 2 games can more or less be best represented in terms of what we call the extensive form game and the normal form game. So you have the extensive form game that's presented in like a decision tree, should we call it. And that is, you'd have your player 1, and they've got to decide in this case whether they want to go with X or go with Y. But in order to make that decision, they need to predict what player 2 is going to do. So as you can see here, if player 1 went with X, player 2 would also go with X, because player 2's payout is actually greater by going with X, 3 being greater than 2. If player 1 went with Y, you notice that player 2 would also go with X. So player 2 would get a payout of 5 by going with X, and a payout of 4 by going with Y. So now player 1 needs to determine how do they benefit. So if they go with X and X, they're going to get a payout of 6. If they go with Y and their opponent goes with X, then they only get a payout of 2. So they actually end up adopting the strategy of going with X, whatever that might be, in a sense knowing that the other player is most likely to go with X because that is their strategy. And that's what we call dominant strategies, and I'll be explaining that in a little more detail later on. And that again can be played out in the normal form game, and that actually gives us the same answer for this normal form game, which is a simultaneous game, as we did with the sequential game, as in with 2 players, and sometimes that's the case. I'll be discussing examples earlier where that can be a little bit different. But as we can see here, we've got player 2 with the dominant strategy. So if player 1 goes with X, 3 is greater than 2, player 2 goes with X. Player 1 goes with Y, 5 is greater than 4, player 2 goes with X. And therefore, player 1 also knows that you only got the X options to look at. So you don't need to worry about the score of 4 and the score of 8. You just need to compare 6 with 2. So 6 is greater than 2, so therefore player 1 will always go with X, and player 2 also always goes with X in this game. This is very, very basic games. It get a lot more complicated in reality. So I want to talk about now 3 types of games, 3 special sort of games. First one I'm going to talk about is Prisoner's Dilemma. So this is an interesting one. This is based on the scenario that you have 2 criminals, presumably working together. They get caught, and there isn't sufficient evidence to put both criminals away straight away. So what they need is to get a confession out of, well, just one of them would do. So what we have here is we actually got a dominant strategy for both players to actually confess. So what you do is, like, for example, if they both confess, they both get 5 years in prison. if just player B confesses and player A doesn't, player A now gets a 20-year sentence. So 20 years, in effect, is worse than 5 years. So you would actually rather have the 5 than the 20. Whereas if player B was to remain silent, not confess, then in a sense by confessing, player A can get out for nothing, for free, because they'd say, okay, you've confessed, you've helped us, it'd be a plea bargain, you get out. Whereas if they don't confess, you get 1 year in prison with the evidence. That might be some minor crimes relating, but not the major crime that actually links you to it. So in a sense, both players have a dominant strategy because 5 is less than 20 and 0 is less than 1. But if they both follow their dominant strategies, they end up with 5 years in prison. If they both go against their dominant strategies, they actually end up with only 1 year in prison. So it's actually a very ironic situation where it's actually better to go against your dominant strategy for a better outcome. But that would only work if you'd have, I suppose you'd have to have a very strong relationship between the players. So they would, definitely confirm that neither are going to confess in order to get this best scenario. If one of them gets scared and decides to confess, they may get out for nothing, or they may end up with the 5 years if the other person also got scared and confessed. So it's quite an interesting case. So what we've got now, we've got another game known as the chicken game, which is quite interesting as well. So what we've got here is we're assuming that if both players stick to what they want to go with the stage strategy, should we call it. So let's imagine the chicken game as being 2 cars driving towards each other, for example. And if both of them decide that they're not going to budge, just go straight ahead, they're both going to crash and die. Pretty tragic scenario. But on the other hand, the person who dodges loses. They move outside and then the one drives through. So the winner is the one that doesn't. So in order to win, you need to stay and drive straight. But if you have a scenario where both drive straight, you get a tragic outcome where they both lose out big time. So this is quite interesting, and there isn't necessarily a winner here. I guess it's whoever's the most committed, whoever gets the least scared, stays in and wins. But if you have 2 people, like I said, neither move. So with this, you need to come up with a strategy to make it very clear to your opponent that you're going to stay no matter what. And if they're utterly, totally convinced that's the case, then they'll have no choice but to dodge. And it's quite interesting because that relates to business as well, who is able to stick with the stronger strategy. So you can look at things like in terms of bargaining and stuff like that, or you can look at it in terms of, I guess, holdouts or whatever, or strikes and things, or all those sort of things. Whoever holds out the longest is the winner. But if they both hold out indefinitely, then they both end up losers. So it's quite an interesting one as the chicken game. Another one, what we've got, is the Battle of the Sexes. This is quite an interesting one as well. And this involves, what you say, a bit of compromise, I'd say. And this is, basically, it's around the idea that you have a boy and a girl, and they want to go out on a date together. But they have different tastes. So in this example, I think you've got player 1, let's say that's the boy, he'd rather go to the cinema. And you have player 2, which is the girl, who'd rather go to the theatre. So if the boy sticks to the cinema no matter what, he ends up with a lower payout. Let's say he gets a payout of 1. And if the girl sticks with the theatre, he would get a lower payout as well. Because they may enjoy the theatre, she may enjoy the theatre, he may enjoy the cinema, but they'd actually rather enjoy their own company. As in they'd rather be together. But it determines which should they go to. Should they both go to the cinema or should they both go to the theatre? Or the worst case scenario is the boy goes to the theatre and the girl goes to the cinema and they're both alone doing what they don't like. So ultimately you'd end up with one of the 2 scenarios where they both end up at the cinema or they both end up at the theatre. So it comes down to, I suppose in reality, you'd probably have a situation where there'd be some agreement that maybe you go to the cinema half the time, you go to the theatre half the time. But it's an interesting game anyway. Alright, what I want to look at now is what we call Zerosum Games. So we moved away from the 3 examples of our Battle of the Sexes, Chicken Game, and Prisoner's Dilemma. So what is a zero-sum game? Basically, it means that what your gain is your opponent's loss. So you end up with a net situation of 0. So, for example, a good one of this is scissors, paper, stone, or another name for it, I think, depending on what country you're from, is, I think it's what, rock, paper, stone, or, sorry, rock, paper, scissors? Confirm on that, but the general theory behind that is you have scissors, which cuts the paper, and then you have the paper, which covers the rock or the stone, and you have the stone that smashes the scissors. So, for example, if player 1 and player 2 both pick scissors, that's a draw, so it would be 0 payout each. Same if they both pick paper. But if player 1 was to pick paper, and player 2 was to pick scissors, then they would lose. Whereas if they were to pick stone, and player 2 picks paper, if they picked scissors, stone versus scissors, stone wins, therefore they would win. And this is interesting because there's no definite strategy, it's all fairly random. So the selection of scissors, paper or stone has equal value in a sense. It really depends on what your opponent does, and it's almost like a game of luck, if you put it that way. And what's interesting with this as well is that you have a second mover advantage. If we play it as a simultaneous game, neither player has any advantage whatsoever. You'd say it's pretty random. Unless, of course, they've got a pattern that they've in the past. They always go with stone, then sure, you probably pick paper all the time. But let's assume that there's no pattern and they're of equal strength. So if you're the first mover, no matter what you pick, you'll always lose. If you pick paper, your opponent will always pick scissors. If you pick stone, your opponent will always pick paper. So there's what we call a second mover advantage. There's another thing that we have, which is a first mover advantage. So imagine that we change the rules of the game so that, let's say, whoever picks scissors always wins. So scissors always beats scissors, scissors always beats paper, scissors always beats stone. So the first mover would pick scissors, and no matter what the second mover does, they will lose. So I know this isn't how, rock, paper, scissors is actually played, but this is just an example of where you'd actually have a first mover advantage. And in reality, that's often the case, especially if you're talking about a release of a new product, that you actually get in ahead of your competitor who made that first move and you've already captured a certain amount of market share. And it actually limits the mobility of your competitors because you've already gained those customers early on. So there's plenty of examples in reality of first mover advantage. I just wanted to put it in a simple context if we just change the rules of scissors, paper, stone. So, okay, let's have a quick look at another type of application of game theory. And this is what they call Bayesian, I think it is, sorry, I get the pronunciation right. So this is game theory where you actually throw in a bit of probability. So this is where there's certain things you don't know about your opponent. You don't have perfect information. So you've got to make your decisions based on imperfect information. In this case, we've got a situation of two people that potentially could want to fight. So you're going to fight someone. You've got a much better chance of winning that fight if they're weak. So let's take, for example, so we've got X. So there's an X probability that the opponent is strong, and there's a 1 minus X probability that they're weak. So if you're fighting a weak opponent, you get the payoff by choosing to fight. So let's say player 1 is going to make a guess that they're up against a weak opponent, they fight. Player 2, hopefully knowing that they are the weaker opponent, will run. If they were to stay and fight, they would lose out by even more by getting beaten up. We have to bear in mind player 1 doesn't necessarily know that. So he's got to make a decision between fighting and running, and that's interesting as well, because if they choose to fight and you're up against someone strong, they would choose to fight back and ultimately you would lose. So it seems like there's a much higher risk in choosing to fight than there is to choosing to run. But if you run, you'll see in all scenarios you actually will lose out if you run straight away. So what scenario do you go with? Do you run? And this is going to come down to the probability. So if you've got a probability, a very high probability that the opponent is strong, then you should probably run. If there's a low probability of them being strong and a high probability of them being weak, then if you were to fight, would give you the better outcome. You can actually calculate in what we call expected values, and what gives you the highest expected value would actually be your strategy. Alright, I'm going to touch on something I mentioned briefly earlier, and that's dominant strategies. So sometimes you'll have a dominant strategy and sometimes that you don't. So we'll look at this first game here. So what have we got here? So you've got player 1. So if player 1 goes, so let's say player 1 has got a choice between X and Y. Player 2 also has a choice between X and Y. So if player 2 goes with X, player 1 is better off going with X. 6 is greater than 2. If player 2 goes with Y, again player 1 is better off going with X. 8 is greater than 4. So that means player 1 has a dominant strategy. So what happens with player 2? it's what we mentioned earlier, they have also got a dominant strategy, and this is using the same numbers. So you've got 3 greater than 2 if player 1's going with X, and 5 greater than 4 if player 1's going with X. So you've got 2 dominant strategies, and therefore you'll get a result of X versus X. Or, sorry, player 1 and player 2 both going with X. So how about if not everybody has a dominant strategy? And as I mentioned before, so you've got player 2 has a dominant strategy, but it doesn't matter that player 1 doesn't have a dominant strategy because they know that player 2 is always going to go with X. So again, you can also reach an equilibrium of X for both players. So that's why it's very important in game theory, or when you're applying game theory, to analyze what your opponent's doing. Because if player 1 had no clue about player 2's payoffs, then they could go either way. They could go with X or they could go with Y. But having that knowledge of player 2's payoffs, which is very important, as we mentioned in Bayesian earlier, that there was what happens if you don't have perfect information. That makes it a lot more difficult. You've got to rely on probabilities, I guess, and how you come out with those. All right, what I'm going to talk about now is what if you can't come up with an equilibrium. So we had player 1 and player 2 coming out with X. But if you have a situation where you don't have a dominant strategy, so in the case here for player 1 doesn't have a dominant strategy because 6 is greater than 2, but 8 is actually greater than 4, so that's what we had before. But I switched the numbers around now, so if player 1 goes with X, player 2 should actually go with Y, 3 greater than 2. But if they go with Y, then they should go with X. So we get what we call a mixed strategy. So how do we go? So there's 2 ways of looking at this. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of a sequential game, and you can see you actually get different winners and depending on who goes first. So let's start with player 1. Let's say player 1 goes first. So you've got to look at the payouts of player 2. So if you go with X, what will player 2 go with? Player 2 would go with Y because 3 is greater than 2. So that would give you an XY, and that would give player 1 a payout of 4 and player 2 a payout of 3. So what if player 1 went with Y instead? So then player 2 would then go with 5, and that will give you a result of 2 for player 1. So player 1 knows that because player 2 can observe their outcome, they can either get a payout of 4 or they could get a payout of 2. So 4 being greater than 2, player 1 would go with X, player 2 would go with Y and get the payout of 4 to player 1 and 3 to player 2. What if player 2 went first? You'd actually get a different result. So if player 2 went first, and they chose X, for example, player 1 would go with 6. So player 1 would go with X and get 6. So therefore, you'd have a strategy of player 2 going with X, and player 1 would go with X, and that would only give player 2 a payout of 2. So what happens if player 2 goes with Y? They go with Y, then player 1 would then go with Y. Why would they do that? Because 8 is greater than 4. So then they would get a payout of 8. So, and also player 2 would get a payout of 4. So if let's say player 2's got a payout of 4, 4 is greater than 2, so therefore they would go with the strategy of Y. So your outcome would be player 2 Y, player 1 Y, if player 2 goes first. Whereas if player 1 goes first, you'd actually get the exact opposite. Player 1 would go with X and player 2 would go with X. So if we play it as a sequential game, you actually see a very, very different outcome. What we've got here is what we call a Nash mixed equilibrium. So this is going back to assuming now this game is being played simultaneously. So it's actually done with a little bit of algorithm. I know, should I explain the algorithm here? Basically it is, a little bit of calculus. So how do you actually go about that? So you actually want to differentiate it in respect to your payout. So the payout for player 1 is, so we say X. So you've got to differentiate it, determine what percentage of the time you want to go with the respective strategy. So if you differentiate, so we'll call the payout, I think we've got it as pi here. So you differentiate pi in respect to X, and that gives you Y equals half. So that means they go with strategy Y half the time. And now therefore we go and have a look at what happens with player 2. Again, using calculus as well, differentiation, you're actually getting a score of half. So I can provide a little bit more detail of that. This is just running quickly over how the calculations are done. And I actually don't necessarily agree with how this is done. I felt the Nash mixed equilibrium is more of a static approach, more as in you're doing something not necessarily half the time, but half of your go is going on to one and half, whereas you're splitting your decisions within one go, rather than half this term, half the next, and so on. So I'll do another video explaining what I mean by that. I don't want to get into too much detail and why I don't actually necessarily agree with the Nash mixed equilibrium approach. But as you see here, so if you go with X half the time and Y half the time, and both the players are doing that, you'll get a scenario of where you have X a quarter of the time, you'd have Y X a quarter of the time, you'd have X Y a quarter of the time, and you'd have Y Y a quarter of the time. So that would be your mixed equilibrium. Alright, I want to talk about another strategy now, which is called tit for tat. So what is that? That's basically what your opponent does in the previous round. You follow up and you do that yourself. So as we got here, so what if player 1 goes with X and player 2 goes with Y? So what player 2 would do in the next round is they would go with X, and whereas player 1 would go with Y, and that would just continuously play out, just swapping tit for tat. It's interesting, you can actually get some pretty good payouts by doing that, but it requires both players following within the same strategy. Like for example, you could have something interesting where they both start with X, so you have X until indefinitely, or both start with Y, so Y indefinitely. So it really depends on what your starting point is. Alright, so I'm coming to the end of this presentation. I'm just going to wrap up on a few things. So just a quick definition here of what game theory is. I think I pulled this off the net, so I thought it was reasonably good, but I'll read it out to you. So game theory is the branch of mathematics concerned with the analysis of strategies for dealing with competitive situations where the outcome of a participant's choice of action depends critically on the actions of other participants. Game theory has been applied to contexts in terms of war, business, and biology. That was a fair definition. That's more or less what we've covered off on. We've kept it fairly theoretical so far, but we've kept it fairly basic. In a few of the other presentations, videos are going to go into a bit more of some different examples. So what have we looked at so far here anyway? Just a quick recap. So we looked at simultaneous and sequential games. Simultaneous games being played out on one time, sequential following a sequence. We looked at the three famous types of games: Prisoner's Dilemma, Chicken Game, and Battle of the Sexes. We've looked at mixed equilibrium and also Nash equilibrium. We've taken a look at zero-sum games. That is where basically the sum of what the winner gets is the sum of what the loser loses. So you've got a net sum of 0. We've looked at what first mover and second mover advantages are and how that can play out. And we also had a quick look at the strategy called tit for tat. Alright, so that takes me to the end of this sort of very theoretical presentation of game theory. I'm going to have a number of other videos coming out in the upcoming weeks. So we're going to look at a few other little things. This is more applied, it's going to be more applied, this is more theoretical. So we're looking at stuff like controlled opposition. What does that mean? Controlling both sides of the game. I've got something I like to call the triple threat game. That's interesting, where you start with 2 players and a third player is introduced, and how the introduction of that third player can potentially change the way the game's played, and also what strategies you apply, and how those strategies can actually influence results, and also what the addition of a third player has on the chances of the weaker player in the initial one-on-one, in terms of how that changes their probability of winning. It's quite interesting when we play through a number of games on that. Another one's market placement. How can you use game theories in terms of how you market your products and how you place them and what competitive strategies you use. So we're going to be going to all of that into those upcoming videos. But for today, that pretty much wraps me up in terms of looking at it in the theoretical side. So if you enjoyed this video, just give it a like. If you are interested in more videos that are somewhat similar, then just hit the subscribe button. There's going to be, like I said, there's going to be a number of other game theory videos coming out. I've also got a number of other videos out. I've still got my economics basics series, goes into the very basics of economics and some of the critical things you need to know. I've also got my conference series as well. So you look at some of my past conference papers, mostly focused around cost-benefit analysis and evaluation, and in the context of transport and road projects. And I've also got another series as well that I'm working over time, which is quite unique in itself, which I call vegan economics. So yeah, so if you're interested in any of that stuff, like I said, I recommend you subscribe, and I'm going to be coming out with videos, most likely be 2 videos each week, which will be on Mondays and on Fridays. And sometimes I throw another one somewhere in the middle of the week, but be assured that I'm going to be putting out videos on both Mondays and Fridays. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'll be seeing you soon.